I'm going to call the meeting to order. Jennifer Newby has arrived, and we have quorum. So the first thing I'd like to do is welcome everybody to this hybrid model, and they can start coming in, right, into the room if they want to join me. So if you want to join me, I've forgotten what our room was called. It's called the Brampton Room, and we are back in it. So if next meeting you want to drive and sit so I can see your face instead of you being a nebulous voice in the ether, that would be lovely. So the agenda, 1.1. Would somebody like to move for approval of the agenda as it is? We have no changes. Dorothy, your name is right in front of me. Would you like to move for approval of the agenda?
Yes, I will.
Great, thank you. Hearing no disapproval, we'll move on to the acknowledgement of traditional territory. And who's going to be doing that today? Oh, wonderful. Thank you very much.
The land upon which we work, live, and sustain ourselves is the ancestral and treaty lands of the Michizagig Anishinaabe, also known today as the Mississaugas of the Credit, the rightful caretakers and title holders of this land. We also recognize the rich pre-contact history and relationships, which include the Anishinaabe and the Ongwe Hongwe.
Since European contact, this land continues to be home to Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. As responsible community members, we value the diversity, dignity, and worth of all people.
Colonialism displaced and dispossessed Indigenous peoples of their ancestral land
and continues to deny their basic human rights, dignities, and freedoms.
We are committed to learning true history to reconcile, make reparations, and fulfill our treaty obligations to the original peoples and our collective responsibilities to the lands, water, animals, and each other for future generations.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you for that acknowledgement of the traditional territory. Number 3 is the declaration of conflict of interest. Hearing none. Oops, I will go into my email, by the way, and check for any notices of people who are not coming tonight. But we'll move on to 4.1, which is the approval of the minutes from the last meeting, December. Is it January?
Yes, it is.
Oh my goodness.
Yep.
I'm so sorry. I meant to welcome everybody back after.
Happy New Year.
Holy
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Yeah.
I'm looking at here. Yeah, December 13th, 2022. Oh wow, that was right before our holiday/Christmas break. So, okay. And with regards to those meetings for the CX of December 13th, 2022, would somebody like to move for approval of the minutes? I see Santhusha, so name in front of me. Santhusha?
Yep, I can move the minutes. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I haven't received any written questions from committee members. There are no notices of motions or petitions. I don't have any delegations. Do we have any public questions with regard to the last meeting? Nobody's looking at it. So we will. That's okay. Yeah, we'll get more work there.
We're good.
Okay. The first report is 8.1, CX Finance Presentation done by Tanya. Sorry. I'll let Jennifer introduce the speaker. Thank you.
No problem. We are joined this evening, thanks so much, Ellie, by Tanya Alice Charles. She is our Senior Manager of Finance for Peelschools School Board, and she is bringing us a wonderful presentation with regards to financial management and special education. So it's a really timely conversation to have as we take a look at our finances within the board. We are committed to responsible spending in special education. We know that we have finite funds, and those funds are to be in support of student learning and well-being. So we really have to exercise fiscal responsibility in this area as in all areas of spending and support for students. So Tanya brings a wealth of experience. She's been with the board for several years and is quite a maverick when it comes to all things financial. So it is with great pleasure that I welcome Tanya and thank her so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So, and can everybody see the presentation on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jennifer. And so I'm the Controller of Finance for Peel District School Board, and I did do a similar presentation, I believe, in April of 2022. So for those that were present for that presentation, I know it'll be a bit of a repetition, but we do have a little bit of an update because now, since that time, we've had also our 21-22 year end. And we've also in December submitted our revised estimates for 2022 and 2023. So with that, so really, what I wanted to share with you and what Jennifer had asked me to share with you is really, the challenges around, our budget, how we get our grants for student needs, the other funding that we get, and really what that then translates in terms of expenses and how we balance the budget. So to start off, I mean, obviously, we are required by the Education Acts to have a balanced budget. So that is our goal whenever we endeavor to do our budget. And of course, it's not only to balance our budget, but also to meet our student achievement needs and our board strategic plans. And, the other things that we're currently looking at are the challenges that we have in doing so. The more recent challenge obviously has been enrollment, and enrollment somewhat has been impacted through COVID, but also now is being more impacted also through just things like immigration patterns and also the cost of living in the GTA. So again, our enrollment over the last couple of years has really had an impact for those factors. And so as we go through the presentation, you will see why enrollment is so important to the board and why whenever there's a change in enrollment, it does impact what the funding that we receive. The other challenges that we face obviously is, when the ministry provides its funding, a lot of times it's with very specific requirements. So again, there's specific ministry initiatives that we have to use the funding for. So it's not necessarily up to our own discretion at times. Currently, we're also working on the ministry directives, and obviously we have some Peel specific elements that we're working on. And so again, those require use of funding. And again, when I say one size fits all at the end of the slide, it's really because the ministry, when they fund, there are 72 boards in Ontario, and the funding in general, they fund very similar across the board. However, the boards are very different. And the challenges, for example, the GTA boards is very different from potentially boards in the northern part of the province or less populous area. So certainly, there are things that we experience that other boards might not be experiencing at the same time. And yet the funding is provided in a similar fashion. The other thing that when we're looking at, how we're funded, we look at, boards really have a very limited source of revenue. If we look at how we attribute our revenue, and our revenue goes towards our daily operations. And when we're provided the funding, generally the ministry, when they either provide it to us in what we call is restricted or unrestricted. And what that means is when it's restricted, it means that the ministry has an expectation that if they provide funding for a specific activity or initiative, that it can only be used in that manner. So we don't have the latitude to use it for anything else. So for example, when we do get provided special education funding, it is restricted. So just for the committee's understanding is that means that whatever monies that we get for special education, we cannot use for anything outside of that. So even if there's other pressures within the board, special education dollars stay within special education. In other areas, for example, we have sometimes some latitude in what the ministry provides, and those are called unrestricted. And in those particular instances, we can look to potentially use certain funds to support other pressing needs. And so sometimes we do have a little bit of flexibility. And similarly, the ministry sometimes when it does restrict funding, it indicates that if we don't use the funding, we sometimes have to return it to the ministry. And at other times we can keep it, but then in future, we still have to use it for the same purpose. Hopefully that makes sense. But so there's lots of variables in how we're funded and a lot of very prescriptive ways that we either have to use the funds or keep the funds or return the funds. So when we look at sort of our revenue streams, as I mentioned, they're very limited. Obviously the board doesn't make money per se, and so we are basically receivers of money from the ministry. And the three basic areas of revenue streams are the grants for student needs, again, also from the ministry, but it's called priorities and partnership funds, which I'll talk about later. And there's other revenue. So those are really the three areas or revenue streams that how we receive funds. So when we look at the revenue streams, although there are three, you can see by this pie chart that obviously the grants for student needs are overwhelmingly the largest source of our revenue. And so I'll spend a little bit more time on that to provide an understanding for the committee as to how the ministry allocates this funding to the boards. Obviously, the smaller portions would be the priorities and partnership funds, and then the other revenue. And other revenue, and again, the reason it's so small are things, it could be things like that where we get some interest revenue, our international students, and let's say when we rent out our facility. So those are what would be typically under the other revenue category. So going back to grants for student needs, because that is the largest area. So that's announced every spring by the ministry. And what I mean by spring, it historically has been in April, but I mean sometimes we've had that information as late as June. Because depending on what's happening sort of in the environment, if there is contract negotiations with the unions, sometimes it delays it. But typically, we hope to get the announcements in April and hopefully latest May, but it has been later than that. And in that, the ministry basically will provide direction in a lot of detail. And I think I mentioned here that it's called a technical paper. And the one for 22-23 was over 200 pages. And basically, it will outline all the activities and that board is supposed to undertake and the calculations of how the funding is arrived at. So for 23-24, we're in January now. We will start our planning for the 23-24 year once we start getting indication of what that technical paper will be this spring coming up. So then looking at the grants for student needs itself, there's three components. And the three components are People Foundation Grant, and that's a grant that is really for costs within the classroom. That's the easiest way to think about it, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's really about the teachers and costs within the classroom. There's a School Foundation Grant, which is the smaller portion here, and this can be viewed as costs within the school office. So it would be for the principal, vice principal, and the admin staff within the school office. And then the other portion, the special purpose or supplemental grants, are all the other grants that support the other two. So there's still a lot of them pertain to the classroom, but they're supplemental in that they have a specific purpose. And so, for example, so special education would fall under this one, and we'll talk about that as well in a couple of minutes. But really, that's how the GSN is divided into those three larger areas. So when we look at the grants for student needs, one of the things that I mentioned is the importance of enrollment. So the reason that the enrollment is important is because the GSN really is formula based, and all the formulas, or almost all the formulas, really are derived from enrollment and what is called average daily enrollment. And the reason it's called average daily enrollment is because it actually takes 2 count points for our students. One count point is in October, and the other count point is at the end of March. And the reason that happens is because the ministry wants to ensure that if a student that they only fund students that are here for the whole year. So, for example, if we have a student that's here at both count points, so in October and in March, we get full funding for that student. If that student, let's say, only arrived at our board at November 1st, we would only get 50% for that student. So, and similarly, if they were counted in October but left in March, we would also only get 50%. So this is, again, when I say formula driven, the ministry wants to provide funding, but it also looks at, figuring out what is the appropriate funding based on, enrollment and other variables. So if you look at enrollment, as I said, it's important. You can see that enrollment has changed over the years. The big spike here is not alarming, but the reason there was a big spike is because in that year, we went to full day kindergarten. So any in the past, when there was half day kindergarten, those students would be only counted as 50%. So when obviously they start counting them as one, that created a big spike in the FDK grades. Other than that, you can see that, we've had some variations. The dip in obviously 2021 was COVID. And then, there has been some recovery. You can see that in the provincial, so the red line is the provincial line. And if you look at where 0 would be, where provincially, things are getting back to kind of more 0 or flat growth. Whereas for Peel, we're still projecting lower enrollment. And so what that means is as we are going through the GSN and as the ministry is figuring out our funding, obviously we will get less funding because our enrollment is down. So how does that translate to the actual sort of dollars and cents? So for example, if you reflect back on the 3 buckets that we get, one of them being the People Foundation grant. So first of all, the People Foundation grant, as I said, it's for the costs within the classroom. So it covers all of these costs: classroom teachers, supply teachers, EAs, so classroom supplies and computers and so forth. And within the formulas that the ministry provides, the different grade levels will get a different amount per ADE, which is the average daily enrollment. So depending on how many students we have, we would get a certain amount per student within these grades based on us having a certain class size. So these are all part of a formula. So first of all, they look at how many students we have. Based on the students, they would determine how many classes we would require, and then we calculate how much funds we would receive. To give you just a snapshot of one of the pages of our technical paper so that it kind of speaks to the formula element, because I've been speaking to formulas a lot. I brought this example from the secondary panel because secondary, we have the 4 grades and they work fairly similarly, whereas you saw for the younger grades, for the elementary, they're very different. So in this case, just to show you how this works, is that they would determine, so first of all, at the very top, you'll see that it says the number of staff per 1,000 ADE. So this column here speaks to how many staff does the ministry think that we would need, or when I say we, boards would need, regardless where they're located, for 1,000 students. And they base that on then saying it's 1,000 students with the assumption that those 1,000 students are in classes of 23:1, meaning 23 students to 1 teacher if it's an in-person class, and in this case, 30:1 if it's an online class. And from that, they say, well, for 1,000 students, you would need just under 40 teachers, and you would need 14 student success teachers. They further then say, if this is how many teachers you need, this is the money that we will provide you to pay those teachers. And you can see there is a very, again, prescriptive rate. Now, again, I think when I came before, I said, even though the ministry says that's how much they provide us, that doesn't mean that the boards can have to pay this. So certainly you can imagine that the salaries Peel, which is in the GTA, might be different than the salaries, let's say, in a smaller town. So again, but the ministry, regardless whether we are in the GTA or in a different board, would always provide this rate as a base salary for a teacher, and then a certain percentage for benefits. Going down here, they would say for paraprofessionals support for 1,000 students, they would fund us for 2.2 paraprofessionals. And in this case, what they consider paraprofessionals include things like attendance counselors, social workers, computer techs. And again, they give us an average salary rate and an average benefit rate. Through COVID, they've also, one of the things I mentioned is the ministry, because the boards obviously don't make our own money, in order to fund us for specific things. So when COVID hit, one of the things they did do is recognize the need for technology. So again, they had to fund us in a specific way. And so now what they've done is included within our funding student technology devices. So $7.27 per ADE. So what they're saying is for every student in the secondary panel, they'll give us $7.27 towards technology for us to manage. And for example, in order for us to have network systems to support the schools better, we would get $19.34 per ADE. So again, you can see that, I mean, although these numbers are small, it's viewed about, multiplying those across our student population. So that would give us a couple of $1 million in both of these students. And then we would have to ensure that we manage them appropriately for our student population. So all these things then would add up to, for example, for the secondary panel, would per ADE, every student, we would get $5,922.75 per secondary student. Okay. So that was how we get funded when you talk about the ADE and within the classroom. Similarly, just very quickly, I won't go into much detail for some of the other areas, but when I talked about us getting funded for the office, the school office. So again, as I said, the school foundation grant is the funding that is for that, and it covers things like the principal, vice principal, secretaries, and school office supplies. So again, for each of these components, I just again did one example, but it would be similar for principal and so forth, and even secretaries. What it looks like, we need to submit to the ministry the size of every single school that we have in terms of how many students are in each school. And based on that, they will determine whether or not they will fund us for a VP or how many VPs they might fund us for. So for example, the way to read this table, here it says, when we get to 600 ADE, so if you kind of go through this formula, a school would qualify for 1 VP. So sometimes we're asked, well, why does some schools have maybe half a VP or have to share VPs. Why does one get one? Why do I? So in this case, for example, we would get funding for 2 VPs if a school was over $1,000. So again, if we choose, again, even though this is how we're funding, if we choose to, let's say, if we're only funded for half a VP and we choose to put 1 VP in because the school really needs that, then obviously we have to find funding in a very restrictive, as you can see, area to fund for the other portion. So again, so we always look at, so what are we funded for, and if we then have to provide either more than we're funded for, we have to figure out where that additional funding is coming from. So it's a balancing act. The third piece that I talked about is really the supplemental grants, and that was, where I said a lot of the other types of funding that we get from the ministry. And so these grants are additional supports or other areas the ministry wants us to focus on within the schools. And it also provides a little bit of the salary differentiation. So even though I mentioned before that they do give us a very flat rate for certain salaries, they do provide a top up specifically if certain staff based on seniority or years of qualification. But again, that's very standard across all boards. So this is a picture just showing how the supplemental grants, I remember it's one of the 3 large areas in the GSN, and this is how it's subdivided. And you can see again here, there are very specific names to these grants, which means there's also very specific ways that they have to be spent or used, and varying amounts of flexibility in some of them. We have a transportation grant. We taught the Spec Ed grant is 27% of all our supplemental grants, and so forth. So this just gives you an idea of the different other types of grants, and all these grants, very much like the ones I mentioned previously, kind of follow the same methodology where there's very strict specific ways that we get funded, and therefore in some instances we can only use for the areas that these grants are meant for. So looking specifically at the special education grant, which was at 27% of our supplemental grants, even that is again yet subdivided further, right? And with, one thing I mentioned in the very beginning is that Spec Ed grant is restricted. So what that means is that it can be used, well, first of all, there's certain sections within Spec Ed can only be used for sometimes very specific sections. So special equipment amount can only be used for special equipment. Similar with the SIP amount, the special incidents portion, right? But overall, the special education grant in and of itself can only be used for special education and cannot, even if there's flexibility in that. For example, if in any year we were ever to underspend it, we could never use it for anything else, just for clarity on that. One of the areas I was just going to quickly touch on is this piece here, which is this, the second largest piece is the differentiated special education needs amount. Will be the next slide, but the biggest section here in red, just so people understand, is the special education per pupil amount. So we talked about the fact that we get a certain amount per pupil in the Pupil Foundation grant, and if you remember, for the secondary student, I think it was 5,900 and something per student. Well, in the special education grant, it takes that ADE as well. So it goes back to our enrollment and gives a certain amount per student as well, right? So that is with a view that for supporting all students. So there's a calculation that attributes a certain amount per student. And then this orange section is a differentiated special education needs amount. It's also supposed to represent the specific needs that are within Peel. And the reason I say within Peel is because it looks at historically what's happening in Peel in terms of our census, in terms of, historically our EQA O scores and so forth. So that piece, and a lot of people, have asked us to say, can we make sure the ministry is providing us the right number? Are we getting enough? But if you look at that piece, which is the statistical prediction model, it's very complicated, and there's a lot of elements that go in here. As you can see, there's student grades, gender, there's census data. So unfortunately, it's not something we in the finance office or anywhere can really validate, but this is how the ministry arrives at that element in terms of what each board will get in terms of understanding the needs within the region. So this is the piece that is slightly different for each board based on their experience. So this is, I would say, the updated slide from what I had shown before. And this is, as I mentioned before, we now have our 21-22 actual numbers, which is the second last bar to the right. And so this graph is just showing that how much we spend over and above our special education specific funding in each of the past 5 years. So you can see that it's been increasing. Now, if you look at 2021, obviously it's lower, and really it's not that we were budgeting to be lower, but if you remember, this was COVID, and so overall spending was lower in the boards and most boards at that time, and so this is more of a reflection of COVID and the fact that a lot of spending didn't happen. Students were out of the classroom, and there was a lot of uncertainty during this time frame. So that's why there was a little bit of dip here. But you can see that there's been significant growth above our funding in terms of a special education expenditure. And obviously, this would mean, if you think about kind of how I was describing our funding, it means that we have had to look at other areas in order to support this funding, because, as I said, GSN funding is very prescriptive. So if we don't spend in one area, we have to then look for funds elsewhere. Other areas that are within the supplemental grants are the language grant. So the language grant is one that supports students that have English as a second language. In this case, again, it looks at enrollment, but this one is a little bit different, that it only looks at enrollment at the October 31st time frame. And so we only get funding for students that we count at that point. And it's based on when students have entered Canada, and they have to have entered from a non-English speaking country. And what the ministry then looks at is over a 4-year time frame, sort of where they are in that 4 years, meaning that in the first year a student enters Canada, they would get more funding than if this is their 4th year being in Canada. So again, that's another type of funding that we get, but again, it's on a sliding scale. And I think I mentioned that, obviously with COVID over the last couple of years, we've been impacted through immigration. And so, we have been getting less funding in some of these areas. And the French language as a second language grant, again, looks at enrollment in French programs, and similarly has different types of metrics for that. The last supplemental grant I want to speak to is the mental health and well-being grant, and it's one of the grants in that one that I showed. And again, this grant has various components and support things that mental health workers, and it supports other areas around safe schools and other things like that. So urban and priority and high school allocation is within these grants as well. So as you can see, there's very specific areas for different types of work we do at the board. So moving to the priorities and partnership funds, so we've moved out of the GSN, which was the bulk of our funding. Although this is a smaller piece of our funding, it's still quite important because a lot of times this is the area where the ministry targets specific areas of need or perceived need, or in areas where they want to make change at the board level. And these type of fundings, when they occur, are very targeted. They have what we call transfer pricing agreements. So they involve us basically getting a contract from the ministry that speaks to us doing specific deliverables and reporting. And in these cases, almost always, if we don't use the funds, they have to be returned. With the GSN, it's a little bit different, where sometimes we get to keep the funds and use them in another year. For these type of funds, they're almost always returned if not used. And there's really no guarantee that we'll get the same type of funding next year. So for last year, you will notice that, well, for 22-23, I should say this year as well, these are some of the specific areas that we got what they call PPF funding. And so there was some math funding, there was additional mental health funding, because I think that the ministry really understood that there's needed recovery from COVID. There was additional special education funds and so forth. So in this cases, we would get the specific criteria within these areas for these specific PPF funds, and we would have to then do the work and as well then report to the ministry about doing specific work under these specific items. And the ministry used this a lot, especially during COVID, because again, in their view, they were infusing very time limited kind of funds to the boards. So for example, they funded us for student computers, they would provide that, but again, that funding did not recur, other than now they're adding that, I guess, $7 and whatever cents per student. But initially they may have funded us several million to get the ball rolling, but that's not a recurring kind of funding. So PPF is to be viewed as it's kind of a project, it's time bound, and when it's done, it's done. Okay, so getting to the end, so just giving you kind of that was all the revenue and sort of how we're funded, just to give you a sense of, so how do we spend the money, just to get it, so if you can see by this is expenses by type. So this really shows the fact that most of the board's funding goes towards staffing, right? So really our people costs. Other than that, we do have, this is for our assets, because amortize of our assets, and the orange one, which is really about the facility costs. So if you can see, this is and this is also why it's sometimes very difficult for us to make changes, because it's very difficult to be flexible when a lot of your costs are not discretionary, right? Because we have really a lot of people costs and a lot of structural type costs. If you look at sort of by area, our costs, again, predominantly are in the schools. So if you look there, we have 79% in the schools, 8% in our facilities. This is the 5% would be in our central administrative areas, and there's a transportation and overall administration. So again, most of our expenses and where we spend our money, and which is it definitely should be, is within the schools. And finally, how do we balance the budget? So I've done a lot of kind of talking so far, but just as a recap, our funding is limited. We have 3 areas of funding, which is the grants for student needs, the PPF, and other income. But then we have a lot of needs or expenses, right? We have the schools, we have special education. Again, we're driving equity needs that we're addressing, governance. We're working on directives, facilities, and so forth. So, how do we balance all of that? So when we get to the budget, the way we try and balance the budget is we really have to start with staffing. Because as you saw, most of our costs are in the schools. So what we need to understand is every year, what is our enrollment and how do we need to staff for our students in the classroom? So those are a must-have. So, and we look at also as well, what are their union requirements as well. We need to ensure that we address those. We need to address any areas the ministry calls enveloped or ones that are restricted. So if the ministry says you must spend here or you must do this, then obviously that's not available to do anything else. So we have to address all those must-have. And then after that, we look at what it is impacted, right? So things that potentially we might have new ministry funding or different impacts that we have. And then finally, we look at is there anything else that we need to or can fund, depending on if we have anything left over after a must-have. So that's kind of how we kind of look at our budget, because as I said, a lot of the things within our budget are must-haves that are required either by legislation, by the fact that we're required to staff our schools in a certain manner, and have a lot of restrictions. So, and with that, I guess I'll take any questions. And I know that was a lot of information.
Trustee Joe. Sorry. Trustee Joe. Trustee Joe, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you so much. Tanya, just I'm impressed. Thank you so very much for this insight, and this presentation is just excellent. You have mentioned in the beginning a little bit about the impacts on the budget by the immigration patterns. Can you explain a little bit more on that, how big that impact is?
So typically, at Peel, we get well, not only at Peel, but in the GTA area, it's an entry point in Ontario for a lot of our immigrants, and obviously they come with families and students. So generally, those students become students of our board on a yearly basis, and there's two ways that we get funded for these students that come into our board. One is through enrollment, meaning that those students become students. And second, if you recall, that's why I showed the language or English as a second language grant, because we also then get funding from the perspective of, if that student is new to Canada and they come from a non-English speaking country, we would also get specific funding for that. So those are the two elements. So if we're not getting immigration, so especially when COVID and everything was shut down, we weren't getting that influx of new families. We weren't getting influx of new students through that area. So when you don't have that, then all you're left with is your current growth in normal births and so forth as they go through the grades, right? Because otherwise, and we as a country really have a lot of immigration and we in the GTA specifically support a lot of immigration.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now, sorry, a technical question. Is this not my microphone here?
No.
No. So what is this here?
That's for live stream. Separate computer.
How do I avoid the feedback?
That's only if people don't mute themselves on the stream.
Okay. So Barb has her hand up. Who else has their hand up? Barb? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions regarding full-time or funding for students at the secondary level. Is there a certain number of credits that the student must be enrolled in order to be considered a full-time student?
Yes. So they do count credits, right? So, but again, as a board, when we submit to the ministry, we count in totality. So again, it's not student by student. So all our metrics would have to aggregate. But if you were to remember that slide I showed, it's assuming that there's for a student, there's 7.35 credits that they're taking in class, and then there's I think a 0.15 that's online. So if you multiplied over 4 years, they would expect a student overall to have 30 credits in 4 years. That's kind of how they do it. But yeah, it's not student by student, because when we submit, we do an aggregate, but that's how they calculate it.
Well, what I'm thinking of is a student who comes back for a 5th year to take one specific credit or two specific credits that maybe they want to take, or they didn't get their full 30 credits at the end of grade 12 and they need to come back for just one more credit. Is that student considered a full-time student?
No, they would not. Like if they're just taking a couple credits, no, they would not be considered a full-time credit. Sorry, student.
Okay, and my other question is regarding the English second language grant. Where does the ministry get the information about when the student first entered Canada? Does that come from the Peel board? How do they know that
Yeah.
student has only been in Canada for X number of years?
Yes, through you, Chair. So yes, absolutely. It does come from every board. So the schools always, when they register their students, that's one of the processes that they have. And that's why we're always really trying to make sure that our schools understand the importance of enrolling students properly, because that information is very important. So we do gather a lot of information through the enrollment process at the schools, and because that's used for the data in terms of our funding.
So does the student need to be enrolled in an English second language program or English language learner program in order for the board to get that funding?
No, they don't. They just have to, when they register, we have to know what country they're coming from and what year in Canada they are. So, but again, they have to be coming from a non-English speaking country.
Okay, thank you.
So with regards to that, just because they're coming from an English speaking country does not automatically assume that English is their first language, because a lot of parents are now choosing to teach their children their traditional language first. So is that not taken into account?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and I didn't go into as much detail as I could have because I spent lots of hours on part of the technical paper. There is a smaller component within the language grant that talks about, students that I would say potentially were even born in Canada, but to your point, families have chosen maybe through their first formative years, like maybe before they enter school, to teach them in their another language and only introduce English when they go to school. So there is a smaller component for that, but and it's not as significant as the one that I mentioned about the immigrant one in terms of English as a second language. But there is also that component within the language grant as well.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Trustee Benjamin?
Trustee Benjamin, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Tanya, I have a question regarding the mental health community advisory group that is being set up at the PDSB. So the funding for this, is it coming from the ministry?
Through you, Chair. Well, all funding comes to the ministry in one way or the other. I don't know if your meaning is that funding specific to
a separate funding. Is it a separate funding for this that's being used, or is it part of whatever funding comes, you're using it for this advisory group?
I would have to check, but what happens when there's two components that we have separate for the PPF, which is the mental health, but we also have components within the GSN itself. So, and sometimes if the special funding through the PPF is not, we might supplement. So, sometimes we do get specific funding from the ministry, and it may not be specific enough to serve our purpose, and we would be adding additional funds from the normal GSN funding.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? No, I'm getting a no. So thank you, Tanya, for that report. I do believe we have a lot of information to go back, to take back and take in. And if at any time you have a question about funding, maybe you could bring it up at the questions period. So, Bart, would you like to move for report of that, for receipt of that report?
Yes, I will.
Great, thank you. At this point, I'd like to mention that I went through my emails and I have possible regrets from Fauzia. Either she's coming late or not coming at all. Anne Smith, again, coming late, leaving early, or not coming at all. And Nicole Buck won't be here. So regrets from those two. 9.2 is the update on definition statement, student census and climate survey for.
Sorry, Julie, 8.2.
Oh, sorry, 8.2, sorry, yeah. 8.2, superintendent's report, oral. I can.
Thanks, Julie. No worries. Thank you. Thanks so much. Good evening, everyone. I just want to thank again Tanya for that very, very comprehensive presentation. I think that we are all the richer for getting all of that information about finances. So thanks again to Tanya for sharing with us. I have something of an abbreviated superintendent's report this week due to the fact that I wanted to make sure that we do have enough time for the presentation. So the finance presentation being one, and of course, we have a right to read action plan presentation coming up as well. So in terms of updates that I'd like to share, I wanted to just draw your attention to that student census follow-up. So in preparation for the upcoming student census, research manager Lynn Hollings had shared with SEAC questions that would appear on the census for input from SEAC members. She was very appreciative of the thoughtful responses provided and has shared a revision for further comment. As directed in the communication, please provide any additional comments to Lynn by entering the information in the document on the link provided. As a next step, staff within the Special Education Social Emotional Learning Department will work with research to consider how the census will be administered. In this review, there will be an exploration of ways to ensure appropriate management of sensitive information, student voice and choice, as well as student well-being. I'd also like to share some additional information on the vacant organization seat on SEAC, as well as the Advisory Council for Mental Health, which I think Trustee Susan Benjamin was just referencing in one of her questions. So the current Peel-SEAC structure has 12 seats for organizations. At this time, 1 seat is vacant. A call-out for a representative will commence in February with the support of the Peel Communications Department. Call-outs take the form of advertising via the Peel Board website and in some cases on social media as well. Currently, the Cecil Department is seeking participation from individuals or groups on the Advisory Council for Mental Health and Wellbeing. As stated in the call-out on the board landing page, the mental health strategy will provide a vision for mental health and well-being in PDSB that aligns with the board's improvement and equity plan, as well as the provincial mental health and addictions strategy. Once the call-out cycle for the advisory council has concluded, then the SEAC call-out will begin. I also wanted to share that we are exploring, this was a topic that was raised earlier in the fall here at SEAC. There were some questions with regards to tutoring for students receiving special education services. So I wanted to share that we are currently speaking with and working with our colleagues in the curriculum department to ascertain whether or not we would be able to offer tutoring programs for students who are currently receiving special education supports. Some considerations around that has to do with the timing and the funding. Sometimes in terms of utilizing funds, we have time limits and funds must be spent by a certain time frame. If we can get extensions, if the ministry decides to extend the time frame, then it would make it easier for us to offer. We're also going to look to survey schools to see where we may offer these tutoring programs, where and when. Schools would need to have available space, they need to have available staff, because the tutoring, of course, would happen after hours. So we need to survey the schools to see if we could find enough schools in areas that would be willing to host this program. But we're happy to have the opportunity, and we are working through that at this time. Should there be a determination that we can indeed offer this tutoring program, we will bring that information forward to the public via the board website and other methods of announcement. So we're very, very hopeful. We're working hard with our colleagues in curriculum to see if we can offer that this year. And that concludes my report. Thank you so much, Madam Chair.
Thank you for that report. Does anybody have any comments or questions? No? Oh, wait. Somebody else there, hand up? Carol? Carol Ogilvie, you have to go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a question with regards to the call out. How long is the call out going to be out for each of those?
I'm not sure what the call out window is. I know that the mental health advisory has been up for about 2 weeks as far as I know. I'm not sure what the call out cycle is, but we did determine that it would make sense for one to complete and then start the next one. So I anticipate I'm going to request that at the very latest, we would be looking to put that SEAC call out in February. I think that the mental health advisory call out, as I said, has already been up for a couple of weeks. So I'm not sure what the cycle would be, but I would hope that we would get our call out for SEAC out certainly early in February, as early as possible in February.
Okay, thank you.
Jennifer?
Hi. Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Okay. Regarding the statement for the census that's been put out, can you just remind me, I'm assuming the intended audience of that will be the students and or parents, and what's sort of the purpose of that definition? What are we trying to do there?
So as I had mentioned, there was and this is just for the benefit of anybody who might have missed it. Thank you so much for the question, and through you, Madam Chair. There was a presentation at a previous SEAC meeting. The student census then is comprised of questions that are directed to both students and families. And so sometimes we have definitions in there to provide some context so that the student can answer the question, so that the family member can answer the question. So if we're asking a question specifically about an identification, we want to make sure that people know exactly what it is we're asking. So we try to provide some context for the areas where the questions are being asked. So at the time when Lynn had shared that, there was some feedback from the committee in terms of wording. And so Lynn went back, changed the wording somewhat. So the way it appears in the census, if this is the final version, which I think that's what she wanted to share, the way it would appear in the actual census itself, hopefully is a little bit clearer and more concise, and has the anti-oppressive lens and the appropriate language to support students to answer the questions appropriately.
Okay, so basically so they can determine whether or not they sort of fit into that disability box. Is that sort of the idea for that set of questions?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Anybody else? Not seeing them. No. Jennifer, would you like to move for receipt of that then?
Sure.
Wonderful. Thank you. We're going to move on to communications for action of receipt, and our superintendent, Jennifer Newby, will be introducing Partners in Learning at 9.1.
Thanks so much. So with regards to the Partners in Learning, this was a request from previous SEAC meeting. Information was shared that we would be revising this particular document. The Partners in Learning document speaks to the partnership between teachers and support staff within the classroom. And so the document is an excellent resource. However, it has not been updated in many, many years. And so given the changes in the context in Peel, changes brought about through the ministry review, changes brought about through our learning as a learning organization, as we continue to learn and evolve and grow, change our methods and change our practices, we felt it would be advisable at this time to update our Partners in Learning document. So one of the SEAC members said, would you mind sharing the original resource, right? Because if people haven't seen it and weren't familiar with it, they thought, yeah, we'd like to see it. We'd like to understand what was being communicated initially, and then we'll really be able to see the difference once the new revised version comes out. So we were happy to share that. So that's why the Partners in Learning document is in. There's no action required on the part of SEAC. It's just sharing the original document. The writing team is currently being pulled together. The applications went out, and so people are applying to be part of the writing team to revise this particular document. And so once the revisions have been completed, we look forward to sharing it.
Thank you. And so we'll receive them as a lump then. And 9.2 is the update on definition statements, student census. Oh, well, we have that, right? We have the update on the, did we not talk about that? 9.2?
Yes, we did.
Okay, so we have the new definition. And are you still looking for input with regards to this, or what are we looking for with regards to this?
Yeah, I'm gonna see for receipt.
It's just for receipt, okay. Carol, would you like to move for receipt of 9.1 and 9.2?
Yes, I will. Thanks.
Thank you. And we will move on to 10, reports from representatives on councils and associations. 10.1 is the right to read action plan. So I'm a little curious as to why it's here. Is it from one of our parent organizations? 10.1.
So this is a presentation, again, that was requested from a previous SEAC meeting.
Okay.
So one of the questions that brought forward, so I'll just go ahead and introduce if that's okay with you, just to provide a bit of context. So at previous SEAC meetings, we always like to follow up and respond to questions and issues that are raised at SEAC meetings. That's the benefit of coming together, and we get great suggestions and feedback from our SEAC committee. So when we were talking about right to read as an organization, as a board, you know, there were a lot of great suggestions in that report. There was a lot of learning that took place after the right to read, and people have raised the question about, well, how is this impacting students who receive special education services? What are the thoughtful sort of interventions that are being planned for students with special education needs? And so that was, again, a great question. We thought it would be appropriate to share that information with SEAC. And so joining us this evening, we have two of our coordinating principals, and it really speaks to collaboration between departments and how closely departments can work together and collaborate for the benefit of students. So engaged in this work, and they're representing their respective departments here. There's other people involved. We have coordinating principal Jim Brooks from the curriculum department, and we have coordinating principal Dawn Addison from special education and social emotional learning. I should actually say the full name, Jim, curriculum, CIA, curriculum, instruction, and assessment. So Jim representing CIA and Dawn representing CECIL. So they're bringing some information to us this evening with regards to how we're thinking about students with special education needs as we address literacy and the right to read. Over to you, Jim and Dawn.
Okay, thank you. And through you, Chair, we will begin. I will share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Yep. Okay, so Dawn and I will go through a few slides tonight just to give an overview, first of all, of the Right to Read inquiry and the report that followed with the subsequent recommendations. We'll also share Peel District School Board's action plan in response to this report and in response to the many recommendations that are included in there. So I'll pass it over to Dawn.
On February 28, 2022, the Ontario Human Rights Commission released a report of the Right to Read inquiry. The inquiry was launched as a result of many students not being taught to read adequately through their schooling, specifically students with reading disability, also known as dyslexia. The Ontario Ministry of Education supports the findings from the inquiry, and changes will be made to the way in which we teach students to read. As we wait on further directions from the ministry, there are shifts we can make immediately to positively impact students as they learn to read. We need to know and understand the role that oral language plays in reading comprehension, difference between phonological awareness and phonics, and how we can teach these skills, especially within our literacy program. If you'd like to learn more about the inquiry, please visit your Ontario Human Rights website.
So the Right to Read focuses on the returning to science-based or evidence-based methods, the teaching of the word reading, word level reading, and the associated early reading skills. The report calls for a shift to the approach of how educators teach reading and includes 157 recommendations. So these recommendations are grouped under the following 5 ideas, one being curriculum and instruction. So it calls for scientific research on the best approaches to teaching reading, explicit systematic instruction in phonemic awareness and phonics, word decoding, and vocabulary. Early screening speaks to a recommendation or a few certainly around all students in kindergarten year 2 to grade 2 receive a common standard evidence-based screening assessment each year. This is for a purpose of identifying students at risk for reading difficulties so that they can receive immediate early tiered interventions. Also, reading interventions. So the report identifies reading interventions as early evidence-based, fully implemented and closely monitored and available to all students who need them in ongoing interventions for all readers with word reading difficulties. The report describes in great detail a tiered intervention support model. So tier 1 being that intervention for all students, where educators apply a universal design for learning approach, differentiated instruction approach to their instruction and assessment. Those tier 2 interventions that the report describes are really for a smaller group of students who do require more intensity of instruction, more duration of instruction, and more smaller group or perhaps even individuals attention there as part of their instruction. And then the tier 3 support is for even a smaller group of students who again require increased instruction, small group individual support, increased explicitness tailored to their specific needs.
Accommodations should not be used as a substitute for teaching students to read. Accommodations should always provide along with evidence-based curriculum and reading intervention. When students need accommodation, for example, assistive technology, they should be timely, consistent, effective, and supported in the classroom. Access to the curriculum meant students can take in and understand the materials being taught. Accommodation is to provide students with support so they can access that curriculum. Access of some of the support is access intervention without a site assessment. They talk about modification, and we have to be careful in lowering the grade level must be used cautiously as only as a last resort after all interventions and accommodations have been tried. They can avoid, this will avoid limiting high school and future education opportunities for all students. Learning for All, as Jim has mentioned, has the Tier 1, which also include the culturally responsive practices as well as differentiated instruction and intervention of small groups within blocks of time. And the Tier 3 is the intensity of support, frequent services, and support from PSSP staff and special education staff. Then we have intervention, and interventions are plans to support students and schools providing increased level of interventions, evidence-based instruction with increased frequency and duration for all students. The right to read and learning for all response of intervention. The students receive a Tier 1 instructions most of the time. Professional assessment should be timely and based on clear, transparent, written criteria that focus on students' responses to intervention. The criteria and requirements for professional assessment should account for the risks and the biases for students who are culturally or linguistically diverse, racialized, who identifies First Nation, Métis, or Inuit, who come from a less economically privileged background. Professional assessment should never be required for interventions or accommodations.
So the Right to Read recommends a shift from a balanced literacy approach to a structured approach when teaching word reading skills. This approach centers the academic research known as the science of reading and combines different components of evidence-based reading instruction that center phonological awareness, phonics, and fluency. As a board, we are committed to ensuring that educators have the knowledge and skills necessary to effectively teach and design comprehensive and responsive reading programs. This commitment is also grounded in our commitment to culturally relevant and sustaining approaches to ensure the academic success of Black students, Indigenous students, and all who are underserved by this system. The chart you see right now on the screen certainly highlights the current approach to teaching reading, which is the balanced literacy approach that the report speaks to, otherwise known as a whole language approach, and it compares it to what the report calls for a shift to the science of reading approach, otherwise known as structured literacy. So currently, when teaching children to read, the current Ontario language curriculum for grades 1 to 8 states that educators use the third overall expectation, which is use knowledge of words and cueing systems to read fluently. So this is known as the cueing system that you will see there. And simplifying this idea, educators prompt students to solve unknown words by considering if the words make sense, if they sound right, or if they look right. So in addition, educators use this cueing system to identify miscues when analyzing a running record or a reading record. So the Right to Read recommends that educators teach foundational word reading skills using a structured literacy approach. The ministry is currently revising the language curriculum, grades 1 to 8, and has committed to removing the expectation of the cueing system in that approach moving forward. The projected release of the revised curriculum is September of 2023.
The action plan. When the Right to Read report was released, a Peelschools report by the interdepartmental team was established to conduct a deep analysis of the report and the recommendations, considering the current content of the Peelschools report. This team was comprised of Central Literacy and Early Years team, ESL, ELD team, speech and language pathologists, school psychologists, and special education colleagues. This team determined that the effective implementation of the Right to Read findings and the recommendation. Classroom teachers will require professional learning to teach word reading skills. Classroom teachers require access to new assessments for learning tools that align with phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, and phonics. And schools would require general resources that are consistent with evidence-based approaches.
So the first part of the action plan that Dawn introduced is the professional learning. So it is essential, critical that we equip educators with the content knowledge needed that reflect the recommendations in the review that represent that shift to teaching word reading skills. For many teachers, this will be new learning, and for others, it will be not. But to support the professional learning for classroom teachers with a targeted focus of word reading skills, the central literacy team, the early years team, ESL team, along with speech and language pathologists have redesigned and facilitated professional learning starting last spring after the report was released, and continued this year, building upon professional learning from last year. So what you see on the screen here are some example professional learning sessions that have happened. These are the 4 learning sessions around rethinking reading that occurred for educators in grades 1 to 3. It's important to note that the central literacy team, in collaboration with the other departments, have also designed and facilitated and are currently doing that this year as well, professional learning for educators of grades 6 to 8. Supporting educator capacity and building that content knowledge around the shift to teaching word reading skills.
To ensure students are centered in instruction and assessment practices, and educators are responsive in their approaches, educators must have access to and knowledge around how to use assessment for learning tools. The report refers to the tools as screeners. Curriculum and special educational emotional learning teams will collaborate in conducting a deep analysis of screeners during the 2022-23 school year. Also, during the 2022-23 school year, we'll work to create a pilot project using a universal screener and progressing and monitoring system for early identifying a universal screener. DIBBLES, Dynamic Indicator of Basic Early Literacy Skills, which is named in the report to share with schools who wish to explore this assessment tool. And we will provide the professional learning and support for educators, special education resource teachers, teachers and in-school support teachers to complete the assessment and be responsive to the instructions based on the data gathered. The Central Curriculum and Special Education Social Emotional Learning Team, Speech and Language in collaboration, have developed a guidebook, kindergarten, grade 1 and 2, and completed with video demonstration with Peel students to support school teams in exploring DIBBLES. So if you look at on the right-hand side where they said one of the literacy assessment, it actually tells you what exactly the purpose is in terms of it, and it's to identify, sorry, I'm having trouble seeing this right now. Identify clearly indicated what it is to identify students who may have difficulties in reading. The diagnostics assessment that they're suggesting be used here is identify here, and we may be using DIBBLES as we do the, sorry, I'm just having difficulty seeing it. As we have difficulties as we're going through the system here. Some of the things that it will show has to do with some of the things you will show have to do. I'm having trouble seeing the slide. Can you just make it, Jim, a little bigger there?
It's very pixelated.
I don't know. I don't think I can make it bigger, Dawn, but
okay, so
I can share if you'd like.
Yeah, learning fluency, prevention, word reading fluency. And on the other side, Peel District School Board, we have been using the one that had been created by with the speech and language pathologists.
So the third part of the action plan is around resources. So we know certainly for to have a wider influence in building educator content knowledge, we need to equip educators with the resources and tools that they will require to support this fundamental shift in teaching word reading. So what you see on the screen here are some sample of resources that have been shared and provided to school teams and educators, and resources that are foundational to the professional learning currently happening. I'd like to draw your attention certainly to one of them. It's a literacy in a play-based environment. So this is a magazine that was created by our early years team, supporting building educator content knowledge around what does the teaching of word reading skills look like in a play inquiry-based environment that we see in kindergarten. We also have sample texts that are here. So Bug Club Phonics and Phonics School and Home. These are decodable texts that the report does speak to and talk about the importance. So our central team has provided each school with sets of decodable texts, Bug Club Phonics and the Phonics School and Home. One set of each of those is around 50 to 60 books. Certainly, it's there for as an opportunity for educators and school teams to review and explore, to try out with students, to be a part of their literacy instruction as they become more familiar with this particular text, and then they can certainly purchase more should they wish. Catch up your code that you see in the center there at the bottom. That is a specific resource for teaching word reading skills for intermediate students for grades 6 to 8. So catch up your code is being used in a few of our schools right now as we pilot that to see the impact that it has on student learning and increasing reading. But it's also foundational to our professional learning that we have designed and facilitated for our grade 6 to 8 students.
Mike's muted. His audio.
Jim, you might have muted yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. And that concludes our presentation.
Thank you, Jim and Don, for that. Does anybody have any questions with regards to this presentation?
Trustee Clark.
Trustee Clark, go ahead.
Okay. What did you mean by a return to science and evidence-based? What were we doing before, if not science or and evidence-based? I have two questions. One is probably a lot shorter, but this one I'll start with.
So as I shared in the presentation, so what we are currently, how we currently teach reading is what's in the curriculum, right, which educators are required to follow, and that is the 3 cueing system. So that has been determined that's not based on scientific research as defined within the report.
Okay. And so my second one is, do we have an estimate or number of students who would be under the right to read methodology?
So this represents a shift in how educators teach. So this would be for all students.
Oh,
so
okay.
This would
Right,
be,
right. Yeah. Okay. I
So
apologize.
as the ministry does revise the curriculum and that new curriculum is released or expected to be released in September, it would reflect the recommendations in the report around the explicit teaching of word reading skills.
Okay, thank you. This was an excellent presentation. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
So back to that 3 cueing system, how long has that been way our kids have been taught how to read?
Good question. I'm thinking, I think as long as I've been a teacher, so I would, I would say the late 90s, early 2000s. I don't know, Dawn, do you have a better idea?
No, I'd said about maybe even earlier.
Okay.
I'm probably here a little longer than you. Yes.
Really? Huh. Interesting. Okay, now I know how my kids were taught. Okay. Aside from me, the parent who taught them phonics. Uh,
And Andrew, and then Barbara.
Andrew, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chair. I just had a couple of questions. First of all, around the scientific-based approach, are other countries using this approach as well? Or like, I mean, I'm sure there's been research done on the basis of going towards the scientific-based approach, but what other countries are you using this approach? Do you guys know or no?
So no, I know school districts in the United States certainly are having similar conversations around this shift, and the shift is happening in certain districts there. I'm not aware of other countries. I can't speak to that.
Okay. And then I guess my other question would be is, will there be additional resources provided to educators for children with special needs? So if they have additional reading requirements?
The new student review process ensures that educators provide student-centered evidence in areas of phonological awareness, phonics fluency, vocabulary, and reading comprehension. And in that SRV, we'll be talking an opportunity to do process of focus with students with ableism and other forms of academic concerns, anyone in terms of support and services that we provide for the students. So students with special needs will also be included under that umbrella. In our action plan, when it's posted and it comes up, we'll talk about there's actually a section of implication for special education services.
Okay, great to know. Thank you. That's it for me.
And the next person, sorry? Barb. Barb, go ahead, Barb.
Yes, I saw a couple of references to early screening. So what do you consider early screening? Grade 1, grade 2, grade 5?
Kindergarten, some of the kindergarten kids, we do early screening in year 2 kindergarten, they're screening then. Right now, our speech and language pathologists use a screening that we or some Peel District School Board have been using for a number of years, but because it hasn't had that peer review and external support, the ministry will not consider it a screening that we can continue to be using. But we have had, and usually it's kindergarten, because those are the kids that sometimes we will find out the kids who are having difficulties and the process starts then.
Well, I know that the ministry's document PPM 11 refers to early interventions, and however, I often hear from parents whose children are having difficulty in grades 2 and 3 that they're being told, oh, it's too early to be concerned. So will this change? Will now the concern, if the child is having difficulty, will this interventions be brought in kindergarten or grade 1?
Well, the screening will be done twice a year, once in the fall and then later on in the spring, so the screening will be done. Tim can give you the numbers exactly when they'll be doing it in terms of timeline. But it is kindergarten, we'll start kindergarten 1 and 2, the primary kids 1 and 2 will be having the screening done.
Okay, that's for the screening, but what about the interventions? When will they come into play? Because right now they seem to be delay for as long as possible. But when the science and research tells us that early intervention is the best.
So the report talks about the tiered intervention support, and like I shared, that tier 1 intervention support would be the responsibility of the classroom educator. So the purpose of the early screener certainly would be to provide the educator with very clear, specific data on each student so that educator can be responsive in their instruction to support the reading development of each individual student. So the Right to Read report certainly highlights that if early screening is done for all students from year 2 of kindergarten through grade 2, and if educators are responsive to the data that's collected from that early screening and responsive in their instructional approaches, then most students will learn how to read, right? The research highlights, years of research that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, that, 95% of, most students with dyslexia or word reading difficulties can learn how to read when given explicit direct instruction in phonological awareness and phonics. And the report does talk about that given this particular approach to the explicit teaching of word reading skills, that close to 90 to 95% of all students can learn to read. So the hope really is that with the early screening, with building teacher capacity around how to explicitly teach word reading skills through that tier 1 intervention support, which would be everyday classroom instruction delivered by the classroom educator, that very few students would require tier 2 supports, and even fewer students would require tier 3.
Thank you.
An intervention is more of a plan and how to support students, providing an increased level of intervention. We spoke earlier about accommodation to provide for students. It's a support where students can access the curriculum. So those supports are available from tier 1. So that even after they have the information from evidence-based research, they have differentiation and university design in order to support the students. Reading intervention in small groups and focus would be like a tier 2. So there's an opportunity from the very beginning in order to support the students.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Barb, would you like to move?
Trustee Benjamin.
Oh, sorry, Trustee Benjamin, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just have a question. This is regarding, I mean, you mentioned that the interventions are done at grade senior KG, I think, kindergarten. What about a student who has a high level of reading skills, spelling skills? What is the support provided to that? I mean, what is the decision taken if you have this kind of a student who's excellent, who has excellent reading skills? Maybe at a grade 2 level, though you are in SKG.
Well, educators must be responsive in their instructional approaches, right? So to be responsive, the early screening does provide that data. So we recognize that within any given class, that data will be varied from student to student. And students will require that individualized responsive approach from the classroom educator. So the part of the professional learning that we're providing and part of the work around the explicit teaching of word reading skills supports educators in learning how to provide that differentiated approach to all students in the classroom, really grounded in the principles of universal design for learning.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, Trustee Benjamin, would you like to move for receipt of that then?
Sure, with pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other reports?
So Through you, Madam Chair, there's not necessarily another report. I was wondering if I could take this opportunity just to go back to an earlier question.
Yes.
And provide an answer that I was able to quickly look up. Even though it just only took a second. And this is going back to the question around the call out for the mental health and then the call out for the SEAC vacancy. So the question was, how long is the mental health call out going to continue? And so I just took a quick look at the board website, and that call out closes on January 31st. So as I had said in the report earlier, we will be looking to post the SEAC call out in February. So the mental health group, that particular call out is closing January 31st, as it has been referenced on the website. I was just able to go and take a quick look. And so that closes January 31st. SEAC call out will go out sometime in February, and I imagine will likely be posted for 4 to 6 weeks.
Thank you for that clarification. I'm sure our members appreciate that. Okay, we will move on to 11, which is questions asked of and by committee members. Do we have any additional questions with regards to the meeting tonight? Has anybody come up with any additional insights? Anything else that they need to get off their chest? No hands up? Oh, wonderful. Okay. Number 12, we are going to discuss the motion action log. 12.1. Superintendent Newby, did you want to, do we have any updates to this? Or?
So the updates are in the motion action log that was part of the package. So no specific updates other than what's already been printed there. So in terms of how the log is recorded, each month the motion action log is provided to SEAC. So if there are any new items that have been added, then members can see that on the motion action log. If there are responses to particular questions, that would be on there as well. Some responses are pending, and so they don't come off of the action motion log until there's an actual response. So sometimes you'll see it on there for perhaps 2 SEAC meetings. It depends on how long it takes us to get the response or to complete whatever the action might be. So it does appear there until it has been addressed. And so once it's been addressed and shared with SEAC via the monthly package that goes out, then it comes off the log. And that was just to make it manageable so that the motion action log wouldn't be 16 pages long, right? So I can share, for example, there was a question with regards to the Student Equity Advisory Committee. And so one of our SEAC members had asked whether or not there was representation in terms of special education on that Student Equity Advisory Committee. So we did get a response to that, but we didn't get the response in time to include the response in the motion action, which it's just, that's just the way it goes sometimes, because we do need to get it into the office in order for it to be organized and then sent out to the committee. So sometimes that happens. So we did get a response to that question, but we didn't get it in time to include it. So the next time we see the action motion log, then that information will be shared, and then the time after it will be gone, because that will be an item that will come off.
Excellent. Okay. And we don't have anything to add from this meeting. So we'll move on to number 13, which is the staff-led consultation. Do we have any staff-led consultation tonight?
No staff-led consultation this evening.
Okay.
So the next time, whenever we have a staff-led consultation, it would appear as the 13.1, 13.2, yeah. If we have any items there. So none for this meeting. Thank you.
And I'm assuming as we get used to this new hybrid model, we figure out how that's going to happen, because we'll have some people here and some people online. And if we're going to have breakouts, we're going to have to figure out how to make that happen, right?
Certainly a conversation to be had, Madam Chair, as we carry on with the new model. And as we think about what works best for CEAC, I think that we are a group that we are always conscious of accommodating people, of allowing choice in the actions that we do. So I think we want to model exactly what we would want to see in schools and for our students. So we'll definitely engage in some further conversation about how best to proceed with our CEAC meetings going forward.
Okay, great. Okay, we come to 14, which is the adjournment. Would one of our new trustees like?
Sorry, can I just, hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I just had my hand up for a little bit. I don't know, there's a few other hands that woke up as well. So before we adjourn, I just had some questions regarding the action log. Is that okay?
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Thanks. So one thing, could we get that response through email and not wait until the next meeting? To that, the first item there about the student equity team committee?
So through you, Madam Chair, I have some information that I can share at this time. I'll still put it in the motion action log so that we have it written. I think that way we have a record of it. If it goes out in email, then it's not quite, you know what I mean? So I still want to have it. So what was shared was that students were not asked to identify. Now this came from, I should say, Superintendent Lisa Hart, who is the Superintendent of Equity for Peel District School Board. So she responded to let us know that students were not asked to identify any special education needs, but purposeful selection was made to ensure representation for students from various schools. And so an example given would be Judith Nyman Secondary School. So they tried to get the diversity of learner profile by reaching out to different types of schools that have different populations of students. And so Judith Nyman would be an example of a school where there's a high percentage of students receiving special education services. So they did it by school without having to identify the individual student. So I hope that's helpful. I will definitely put that information in the action motion log so that we have a record of it.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful, but just not sure the best way to get full inclusion on that team. But I mean, you guys know better about that. That seems to, you've got a lot of kids with special education needs in the general population as well. They need to be represented in different, anyway, that's what it is. So we'll move on. The other question I had is about the things that have been, so am I to understand that the only things that we see there today are the only things left on the action log at this point that we see in the agenda today?
Everything else has been addressed.
So last meeting, and I'll go back to my notes, that there were a number of items that we didn't agree that were fully closed. So we were going to keep them open. So I'm not sure what happened to those items. There were, I think one of them was about the accessibility committee. I will have to go back to my notes, but there was a number that people had brought up during that meeting that we didn't feel were fully closed by the actions that had been taken. So we wanted to hold on to them until they kind of came to fruition. So would I just send that to you, Shelley, or how would we make sure that there's
send it to me.
So can we take a moment through you, Madam Chair, just to clarify based on what I have in front of me, and I apologize for the changeover, right? And so I recognize that we had a different superintendent for a couple of months, and so Ted Byers did communicate with me, try to let me know what had been covered and that. So if something had been missed, we certainly do want to address that. So if I could just take a quick second just to go through the items that are currently still open. There are items that are still open on the action motion log, right? So we tried to indicate that by the words follow up, which basically suggests that it's not finished, there's still follow up, right? So if you take a look at after the November 9th, the first section of follow up, it says follow up by Ella Hart, that was Superintendent Lisa Hart, Equity. So I did say that we have the answer, it just didn't get to us soon enough to go in. So that still has to go in. For item number 2, question number 2, there's follow-up by SEAC accessibility representative. So again, that's an item that's still open. So there are open items still on the action motion log from previous meetings, right? Number 3, so 1 was student equity, 2 was accessible bus, 3 was in the board brings SEAC meeting review. So 3, there's follow-up by Cecil, so follow-up by this department, and so with an eye to September 2023. So those are examples. We've tried to indicate where items still remain open, and we tried to indicate who will be following up. If we know when that follow-up will happen, we put a timeline in there. So to say, you know, by next meeting or to be determined, if we know, we try and indicate when you can expect the follow-up, but there are still items that are open. So I hope that that helps.
Yeah, these were some of the older items that maybe we'd had a discussion about it, but it still didn't resolve the initial question. So they were much older items. So I don't see those there.
There were some items that had been answered, but some of the committee members did not feel that they had been answered fully.
Like the answer, for instance, I'm trying to remember, the answer was like, we're going to have a meeting in 3 months. Right, I think from the accessibility committee, there were things like that. So our thought at the last meeting was that until things are actually moving again, that should probably stay on the list to keep track of it. Those were the kind of, I remember, because it wasn't just the accessibility committee, a number of other members brought up items as well. So I guess we'll just maybe float them back up again to you, Shelley, and we can decide whether they belong, or they need to stay.
Yeah, send them to me and then I'll have a discussion with Jennifer and we'll decide if they need to come back on fully or how they need to be monitored. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Excellent.
And sorry.
You have another question, Jennifer?
Yeah, just sorry. So on that question number 3, about the K-12 education standards review that's we're looking at September 2023. Can I just ask has the board had a review of it, looked at it, and kind of done an assessment at all? It's not that you have to bring it to me, but has someone in the board kind of looked at that and said, hey, we're doing pretty good? I asked this when it first came out and didn't get a response, but like, it's a really great representation of what the perfect situation would be. I know it's not being enforced right yet. I just want to know if anyone sort of looked at it, or are we just waiting until it's enforced?
Through you, Madam Chair, just to share, I did look at the resource. I agree that it is an excellent report for review. The reason that the timeline is looking like September 2023 just has to do with the current priorities in terms of the board, right? It's very difficult to do many things well when you're doing everything at the same time. And so we have, people as individuals certainly, and individual departments have had a look at it, but in terms of how that integrates into our board improvement plan or how that integrates into the work of various departments, our focus has been on right to read, our focus has been on the ministry review and aligning our curriculum goals with equity and anti-racism and anti-oppression. So that has been the focus for our school improvement. Certainly, again, taking a look at our literacy expectations, our numeracy expectations, and certainly some work around accessibility has been things that we've needed to focus on. So it's certainly worth looking at. I can't speak to everyone in terms of whether or not every person in the department has taken a look at it or other departments, but certainly it is on our radar. And so we want to have the opportunity to bring something forward in the fall of next year, because by that time we will be well on our way with Right to Read, and that work is happening. We would have done our work around some of the partnerships that we needed to address, and certainly the student review process has been a major project for special education and social emotional learning this year, not to mention the expansion of the mental health and the creation of the advisory committee. So we're just trying to manage the number of projects and the number of initiatives that are going at any given time. But absolutely, it is our intention to do a deep dive into that particular report.
Okay. My thought is just it really lends to that equity piece for our students with special needs that we've been working so hard on in general. I think this really speaks to that piece for our students with special needs. So I look forward to it in September.
Thank you, Jennifer. Okay. Number 14, the adjournment. Since you're in front of me, Jennifer, would you like to move for adjournment now?
Sure.
All right, the meeting is
Sorry,
adjourned.
before I move that, I did see some other hands up earlier. Can you just make sure everybody's...
Does anybody else have their hands up? I'm sorry, I don't have my device in front of me. I can't monitor the hands up. I'm really sorry. I will figure it, and nobody else has their hands up. I'm getting ahead. So I promise next time I will have a device in front of me where I can have us monitor what's going on. I'm being thrown another learning curve.
I will then move
share
for
a meeting in this new environment. So I apologize. I appreciate everybody's patience with me. If I make boobs, if I
you're doing great.
Miss things, if I forget to thank people, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for coming and providing us knowledge and for asking our opinions and for our input. Thank you, everybody. And with that, good night.
Good night.
Okay.